First off, the question is, who is Andrew Huberman? And if you clicked on this video, you probably already know who it is, but we'll go through that. We'll go through who Bremont is, what the watch is, and how I found it. So I was watching a video the other day. Andrew Huberman is a neuroscientist. He covers a lot of different things. Mainly it has to do with how you interact with the world and how that affects your body. So sunlight exposure, cold plunge, everyone's into cold plunge right now, cold plunge therapy, saunas, as well as just overall brain neurotoxins, some studies. He's a professor at Stanford, and so he's got a background in neuroscience specifically, but he goes on podcasts and talks about all sorts of different things. I was watching a podcast by Chris Williamson the other day that had this clip right here.
57 minutes per week. Minimum of sauna. That's what they found. What did they find? Increases brown fat thermogenesis, thereby metabolism.
I was watching it and I thought, what is that? What's that on his wrist? Because, you know, if you're in this hobby and you're obsessed with watches, you tend to spot the things that people are wearing, or you tend to be interested in why would someone pick a certain thing? Because for us, watches are self-expression, right? So they tell you a lot about the person. And for someone like Andrew Huberman, which I watch his stuff every so often, he has the same style every single day. It's a black shirt, or at least every podcast, black shirt, same beard, grooming. I mean, the whole thing's basically the same. I only recently learned in the podcast that he has tattoos that obviously he covers up. But the point is that the watch is the one thing that a man can have that is a little bit more of a jewelry element, a little bit more of self-expression. So in his case, I zoomed in. I had to use, I think, an iPad in order to figure out what it was. And then I went online and I tried to see if I could figure out what the model was, because it had an interesting sub-dial layout of one on the top, one on the bottom. And that's not something you see all the time. Typically, it's a tri-layout, like a Breitling Navitimer has 3 subdials at the bottom, or a Daytona also has the same thing. So this top-down subdial was something that was unique. I found online he typically wears a Bremont watch, and so then I went down the rabbit hole to try and find if I could find that watch in Bremont, or a subdial top bottom in Bremont. I eventually figured it out, and then I bought the watch so that I could actually review it, because 1, I've been interested in Bremont in general, and 2, I thought the watch looked pretty cool. So I thought, hey, bring it in, do a review, get to talk about it, get to share it. So the watch itself is obviously made by Bremont. Bremont itself is a company that was started in 2002. It's 2 brothers. They have a whole story behind why they named it Bremont, which honestly is quite a good story. I assume it's true, but it's a very good story. They're basically flying a 1930s biplane in France. The engine isn't running very well, so they have to basically emergency land. They land in a farmer's farm, and he is very hospitable, feeds them. They talk for a while. He's also an engineer. He repairs clocks. And basically they said, you know, thank you for the hospitality. We appreciate it. You basically saved our lives, giving us a place to land. And then obviously we're very hospitable. Beyond that, we should honor you, or we want to honor you, or thank you in some way. And his name was Antoine Bremont. And so the name of the company is Bremont. So I really like that background. I like that obviously it's a smaller company. They're not owned by a conglomerate. Most of the watch industry is owned by big conglomerates that own all the brands. You buy the brand, but you don't realize you're buying to the same company. You know, regardless if we argue this brand over this brand, typically it's all funneling to the same people. So I appreciate that. They're a British company, which is also unique, and they make watches specifically designed to tool-oriented watches, flight watches more than anything, but oriented towards people that work all the time with their hands, or in jobs that are more taxing. And this is a great example of that. So the model itself, this is the Bremont Alt 1 ZT51, I think. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure I remember that correctly. The point is, that it is a world traveler watch is the concept behind it. So it has the 5-1, I believe, has to do with like it looking vintage. So it has faux patina on it. So it's that tan color on everything that's luminescent on the watch. And then you also have the ZT's Zulu time. So it means that it has a GMT function in one way or another. So this has a GMT function, and it also has a chronograph. So it's jam-packed with features. If you're someone that, you know, only wants one watch and you're okay with a chunky beast, this watch does all of those things. And I imagine that appeals to someone like Andrew who's traveling all the time, and I'm assuming wants a more subdued watch. And this kind of nips both in the bud. I would assume that he's like most people in that he admires Bremont. like myself, Bremont is known for their great customer service. They really take care of their customer base. And I imagine also as a smaller company, it makes sense that they'd have to, but that's a really core piece of what makes Bremont different is the experience when you're buying, or so I've heard. I haven't bought from Bremont, but that's what I've heard. And their warranty replacement and all that stuff is what I hear the best about. They do have this thick, and when I say thick, I mean a thick strap. I'll actually put the measurement on the screen. So this big beefy strap is definitely part of what adds to the overall heftiness feeling of the watch and toolish feeling of the watch. It's got a brushed case finish on the entire outside except for a mid case here, and the mid case here is a DLC coating. It's got 4 crowns on it, which is obviously unique. They've got the start and stop pushers for the chronograph. They've also got obviously the main crown to operate the date and the GMT function, and obviously operate the minutes and hours. And then on this side over here, they also have a rotating bezel. Now they've patented this. It's basically a rotatable bezel on the inside, like you've seen on an alpinist with the compass. So rotatable bezel on the inside, but it clicks. So at each of those marks, each half hour, it clicks into place. And so it gives you the ability to not have to stop the watch or alter the GMT hand to be able to track an additional time zone. People say you can track 3 time zones by using it, but I'm not good enough to know what time zone the hour hand is in by itself without looking at the number. So I would say that it's kind of 2 time zones, but you guys can argue with me on that. So the watch itself has inside it what Bremont calls a 13.25 BE54AE. Now, this is the issue that I have with the majority of the watch industry, which is that essentially inside here is a ETA 7754 or a Valjoux 7754, because they're all built the same, that's chronometer grade. Now, on the website, it obviously says modified. My assumption is that modified is essentially that the rotor itself is a custom Bremont rotor that they put on there. But the rest of the watch, because I've disassembled a 7750 unsuccessfully and put it back together, so I know a lot of the different parts. That's why I knew what was inside right away. The 7754 is essentially the 7750, but instead of date, it's got a GMT along with the date. And the subdial layout is slightly different. Now, Bremont also talks about all the different components in there, that it also has I'm going to butcher the pronunciation because I know it's French, a glidecoeur or glidecoeur balance in there. It's also got an anachron hairspring, which I'd never heard about yet, and a few other things that are technically supposed to be very impressive. The problem that I have with it is if you buy a 7754, an ETA 7754 at the chronometer spec, it comes with all that stuff. It comes with that version of balance. Essentially, as you move up the different levels, I'll put a chart over here while I'm talking. As you move up the different levels, you'll see that basically you get different materials that swap in because they're better for temperature resistance or positional variance or magnetic resistance. Any of those different things are why people move to different materials to make the hairspring or the balance spring or whatever. I could do a whole long-winded explanation as to the movement itself, but essentially it's an off-the-shelf movement that they bought, but make it sound like it's in-house. They might say later on the website that it isn't in-house a little bit later, but at first glance, it makes it seem like they're saying it is, and that's the part that I don't like very much. While I appreciate the company, that's something that the whole watch industry does that I think is a little shady. And I don't really like that. Either it's in-house or it isn't. I don't think in-house is really worth it. In my opinion, I'd take a standard movement over an in-house movement any day of the week, unless it's been tried and tested like a Rolex movement where it's the same base caliber that's been used for 70 years. They just make slight modifications. Other than that, because they have an in-house movement that has decades behind it. If it's not an in-house movement with that amount of time behind it, you run the risk of having some serious issues. So wearability wise, it's chunky. I mean, if you're looking for a beast watch, 43 millimeters, 16 millimeters thick, it's a chunky guy, especially if you swap it out on the strap though, and put it on something different. I found that it was a lot more wearable. I've been wearing it for, I guess, about a week and a half now, most days, not every day, but most days. And I love the functionality of it. The fact that I can start and stop the chronograph anytime, it's got good water resistance, very usable, very legible. The size itself is masculine. It's definitely a different design look than what I'm used to. And as I said, I appreciate Bremont as a brand and as a company. And so I wanted to really get to know the watch a lot better. The 16 millimeters didn't really bother me over time. I think it has this dome crystal on the top, and so it adds a little bit of height, but also the rotating bezel adds even more height to it. So it's decently more thick than my Navitimer. It makes my Navitimer look relatively slim by comparison, but you kind of get used to it over time, just like anything with watches, you get used to it. So personal preference on the thickness aspect, but the wearability, I think it's actually been pretty good. It's not been too top heavy. You have to wear a tight strap, at least in my opinion, to make sure that it works. Because it doesn't have a bracelet, it doesn't get too heavy on your overall wrist. So it's not like a big chunk on your wrist. And that kind of leads me straight into my positives. A few of these things I really like about how they designed it. The strap itself, you can see where it hits here. They've got a curved spring bar and a curved strap so that it closes that gap even tighter to the case. It's a nice little touch. It's relatively rare that you see that. So it's a nice touch. That being said, if you're going to buy this and you try and swap on straight straps, you're going to know that it's going to look different. Just keep that in mind, that it's not the exact, or you can't reuse the spring bars because they're curved unless you have a curved strap. So just know that if you're going to be able to buy it. The mid case being a different material and the layered honestly breaks up the thickness from a visual aspect quite well. I can see that it's thick, but it doesn't look quite like a Tudor, for example. I had the Tudor Chrono in. It's actually still in the other room. I'm trying to sell it right now. That watch itself, because it had just the slab, looked really thick visually, even though it was thinner than this one. This one, sure, looks thick, but it doesn't look as thick as the other one because they've broken it up with that black element there and the layers to each of those black elements. And I think that really helps. I love all the different functions on it. I love the actuation of the chronograph. That's something that I've always loved about Valjoux 7750s, ETA 7750s, all those calibers, the Salida movement, I think it's the 550 if I remember correctly. All those have the same, I believe it's called an oscillating pinion inside it that actuates the chronograph, and it makes it for a very smooth experience. And I've always enjoyed that feeling. It's still cam actuated rather than column wheel actuated, but it feels really smooth when you actuate it. I really enjoy that. Very snappy, very responsive. I also like the function of the rotatable bezel on the outside. The fact that it's a chronograph and a GMT mixed together, in a overall subdued tool watch oriented aspect. So I'm actually going to keep this for a little while. I really want to percolate on the idea of bigger watches and get used to them for a little while. And, right now, it doesn't feel like a watch that I'm going to keep, but it is a watch that I appreciate and that I want to wear and kind of get used to and have some enjoyment with while I have it. So the negatives, and there are a few that I always have gripes about these sorts of watches. The first thing is obviously just going to be the overall size. The thickness it's beefy. It's not too bad. You can easily wear it, but it is chunky. Some people out there can't wear it, smaller wrists, or they prefer smaller, lighter watches like I have and do sometimes. So that's one of the things that is going to probably hold a lot of people back. The chronograph itself, one of the issues that I have seen with Valjoux, and I'm starting to see with this, is that when you reset it, that chronograph hand can sometimes creep backwards. And I don't know if it's because the seconds hand hasn't been set down hard enough, and so the seconds hand moves a little bit on the pinion that it comes out through, or there's something else that I don't actually know about. But I'm noticing that seconds hand, when I reset it for the chronograph, is not directly at 12 anymore. It's starting to come a little off. And that's something that I have seen on these movements before. The subdials layout here is kind of personal preference. And the last is pulling out the crown is a bear. And I feel like I've seen that on several 7750s now. And I think it has to do with how that crown is placed in. When they're attempting to get water resistance, you have to have these gaskets. And I think that that's causing a lot of drag when I'm trying to pull it in or out. And so I'll take the water resistance, as a price to pay, but it's really hard to access this crown. And so it's really hard to pull it out. I have to sit at it or really let my fingernails grow out to be able to pull it out. So just keep that in mind. That's one of the things that is kind of difficult on these. I do like that as a quick set date though. I'm not used to that on my Navitimer, and that's a nice perk to have on this watch. I use chronographs all the time, usually my Navitimer, but for the last week and a half I've been using this. It's perfect for that. So I imagine that all of that stuff is incredibly useful for him and incredibly useful for most people, especially travelers that want a tool-oriented watch. So that's pretty much it. I'll cover this also in my watch collection review that's coming up. So if you're interested in that, please subscribe. And if you're also interested, I have channel memberships nowadays. If you want to help sponsor or help the channel grow, essentially it's like donating me money and you get some perks out of it. But you can find all that information down below. I'll see you in the next one. Take care.